Well, good evening and welcome to the second webinar in our PBL series trying to help our AC teachers get ready for their STTIs, which for some of us are approaching quite rapidly here at the beginning of June. Tonight we're going to go through another webinar with Tim Kubik, who has been really helping us see what project-based learning is going to mean and how we can use it better in the AC projects. Couple things for those of you who were here last week, and of course those of you who are new, there are a couple things about tonight that are important to know. In the email Marna sent out, you received a copy of the West Virginia project. First off, if you try to read that from page 1 to the last page, it'll be a little overwhelming. That's not the intention. Just as something to scan so you can get a concept of what it is that teachers are going to have when they get out to the field. After your STTI, you'll be able to look at that without the panic it may inspire now. Another thing you received was a simple little handout, about 2 pages, that had 3 case studies on it, which really boiled 3 projects down to some basics so that we can talk about those tonight. So let's just keep that handy, that handout that was sent out to you if you have that around, because as Tim later goes over them, that'll give you something to look at so that we can get involved in some conversation. So with that said, I'm very excited to get started tonight, so I want to turn the microphone over to Tim.
All right. Thank you, Zach. Looks like I'm on, so I appreciate you transferring things over. Tonight's topic is called Moving Forward, Need to Knows for Students and Teachers. And the term need to know is going to be an interesting one to explore throughout the case, and we will get eventually to talking about why there's a diamond ring there. For those of you who are new, just briefly, my name is Tim Kubik. I've got 24 years of teaching experience. I've been a national faculty member with BIE over the last 6 to 7 years. And then I've started getting involved in supporting career technical education with 2 different programs, ACE Leadership School in Albuquerque, New Mexico, for the last 5 years, and then the Ohio Association of Career Technical Superintendents. I've been working with them the last couple of years on a health informatics program that they developed. So that's sort of my background. And to look back on what we talked about last week very briefly to sort of recap, we explored the question of voice and choice for students and how understanding when to give students appropriate voice and choice in a project helps you to become a more professional educator in making decisions that support their learning. So to recap a couple of things that came from that. One thing is a very important stress in what I call backfilling the content. There's a tendency often to want to front load students with lots of information. And we'd like to encourage you to let them tinker and explore projects first and then backfill information when they need it. We looked at some case studies that talked about that last time around. And we also talked about how that's not just a job that you need to work on, but in many projects, teachers may decide to have a subject matter expert come in early and tell the students everything they need to know, and I'll put that phrase in scare quotes, because they think that students won't be able to figure any part of the project out unless they've been told everything by themselves as a teacher or by an outside subject matter expert. And we'd hope that you're thinking about using outside subject matter experts to get students curious and to come up with reasons why they might need to know this information, rather than just having the person come in from the local factory or hospital and tell them everything they need to know to understand the project, because that can often crush student inquiry. And need to know is connected to deeper inquiry, which will be our last topic next week. So we looked at 2 case studies last week, and we focused on 2 21st century competencies that can be accomplished. One case study involved collaboration, where students were asked to research and share ideas for wave generators and move from their individual ideas to team prototypes. So collaboration became a chance to really work on giving students some choice about how they do things and some voice in their ideas, but also a challenge to figure out how to reconcile those differences. The second case study that we looked at was in communication, another one of the so-called 4 C's of 21st century competencies. And there we looked at a question of how students can work in a mentor relationship with people working in facilities that are generating power or using high amounts of power, to think about heat exchange and the way that plants will cool that energy. And rather than just presenting to a panel of experts at the end, which many people understand is an important part of PBL, this is a chance for them to present and share their ideas with those outside subject matter experts along the way, work on improving their communications so that their final panel presentations would be very high-quality professional conversations rather than simply a student's perspective on what things might be shared with outside experts who then question whether the kids really get it. So both of these, collaboration and communication, were explored in the context of voice and choice. And we'll look at two other C's tonight, critical thinking and creativity, as we think about how those can create need-to-knows understood. We also talked a little bit about balancing assessment last week, and I just wanted to recap these points so that people who are new would have a chance to see that. Your AC projects have a lot of stress on traditional assessments that make sure that students are ready for careers in those professions. But we also looked at opportunities for students to do self and peer assessment, team assessment, as formative processes that would help them better understand the material, and would focus on the process of learning to give you an opportunity to use those 21st century competencies, and stress the importance of trying to balance that experience for students. So the traditional assessment, the big test at the end of the unit, which may be required for a student to get a certification, seems a lot less intimidating. So you may be wondering, as we looked at all that, so what's left for me to do as a teacher? And so that gets us on to a next question. Not only do you have to think about voice and choice and what's right for students at certain points, how much choice they should have about moving forward with a project, and how much they should get to share their own ideas and beliefs, their own voice in that project. We also want you to think about need-to-knows. And we put the term need-to-knows in these bracket quotes because it's a problem that's often misunderstood in thinking about PBL. So our driving question or essential question for this webinar is, what are my need-to-knows as a teacher in order to keep my students in the need-to-know? So what are some of the things that I need to know in order to get students really wanting to do the learning? And you see there that there are sort of two different understandings of the term need to know. Teachers often think about need to know as the stuff that they need to cover with their students. But we want need to know to also mean the why they need to cover it. So that's why we're putting those in there. So a definition of need to know from BIE's PBL handbook is that students have a compelling student project such that the reason for learning is relevant and the reason for learning that relevant material becomes clear to them. I need to know this to meet the challenge that I've accepted. So it's not just what they need to know, but the why. And the diamond ring has sort of become a symbolic of that at Buck Institute for Education and are thinking about communicating about need to know because it's a great example of a time in both men and women's lives where you need to know some things, but you also need to have a real why. Most men never think about color, clarity, all that other stuff that go along with diamonds until they meet the right woman. And then they really need to know who that woman is, and they need to understand her and think about the right kind of diamond to buy her for her if they want to propose to her. The need to know is that information about the ring, but it doesn't really become a need to know in terms of a reason to know it until you have met the right person. And the same is true for women. I think in many cases women may imagine what their ideal diamond ring is like, but they need to know what kind of ring their potential husband is going to propose to them with, so they don't run into a situation like happened with me when I proposed to my wife, and we were in graduate school and she just looked at me and said, "You can't afford this." So women have to think about what the need to know is also. They need to think about a ring that's going to be appropriate for the person that they're marrying, no matter what they thought they knew about good diamond rings. So need to know is both this combination of the facts that you might need to know, but also the reason you would need to know it as we go through it. So let's talk about student need to knows a little bit to make this tangible in the world of our classrooms, rather than the example about marriage proposals. Students need to know what they want to be in order to know what they want to study. And we know this is part of career technical education. We know that it's one of the advantages of career technical education, actually, is that many students come to our classes because they have a sense that they want to be a particular profession and they want to focus on that rather than take more general course of study that is associated with traditional high schools. So we know that they know that, and that they need to know that, and they want to know that. Oh, and now my slides aren't advancing. There we go. And we know that they need to know what it takes to be who they want to be. It's one thing to say, hey, I'd really like to be an electrical engineer, or I'd really like to work in sustainable energy. Once they've made that decision, that's fairly quick to decide, although students will often change their minds about that decision. But when they say, I think I really want to be a mechanic, it may take years for them to know what it takes to be who they want to be. It's not an instant short list of things that they have to go through. To be a true professional may require a lot of study. And so they need to know what it takes, and that may take some time. The third thing that often is associated with students in career technical programs in terms of their need to knows is, yes, they need to know that what they're learning is relevant, and the AC projects provide a wealth of relevant information for students to learn. But they want to know that this is stuff that is going to help them become employable, not just the things that they need to know to have the career that their teacher is sharing with them, but to be employable right now in the world when they graduate. And as you can look at here in this image from the SRED programs, you know, the world that you may have experience with as a career professional before coming to career technical education may have changed significantly, even in the space of a year or two. You know, what goes on in digital music today is very different from what was going on in digital music a couple of years ago, or even 5 or 10 years ago. So that's where subject matter experts can help a lot as well. But all of these need to knows are long-term need to knows. They're things that we hope students will want to do the work in the AC courses for, because they do want to have that career and they do want to be employable. But those long-term need to knows actually don't go all that far to sustaining student interest in a project. Because students, being teenagers, are often fairly impatient about what they're learning, and they often ask questions about how things are relevant to them right now. It's a rare student who is so driven toward that career that they're going to go through any learning experience for the sake of earning that understanding. They're often very interested in what I would call more short-term need to knows. And if we look at BIE's project design rubric and think about how it defines need to know, we see some spaces where short-term need to know opens up. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. But let's look at the, what the BIE rubric says about a well-designed project where need to knows are compelling for the students. You can see some terms here that are italicized: genuinely, relevant and meaningful, powerfully engaged students. And while a chosen career path may be genuinely interesting to a student and relevant and meaningful, it may not powerfully engage a student right now because they may not see an opportunity to actually play with it and use it down the road. And that's a big part, or not down the road, but use it immediately. And that's a big part of effective project-based learning, is a chance not just to prepare for a career, but to use that knowledge and participate in society today. So that they feel invested in the project and it promotes inquiry at a deeper level is what we're shooting for here. So these are the two indicators in the BIE rubric of what a effective need to know is in a project. And you'll see in the second one there that we often go for powerful engagement with an entry event. Something that launches inquiry, that gets the project started. But that's always also, it's a short-term thing that doesn't necessarily last the whole way through the project. So there's some other things that we do as well. Driving questions or essential questions are an important part of short-term need to know. Students will respond to that driving or essential question for a while. It may not last through the whole project, and so oftentimes teachers will allow students to rethink their driving questions. Or is often the case in the AC courses, there are sub-essential questions during the course of the courses that give students a chance to think about the big picture question, the essential question, somewhat differently, unit by unit or element by element as they work through the programs. So good questions that re-spark inquiry for students are an important technique. I mentioned entry events when we were looking at the indicators. And many teachers will use an entry event to kick off their project. You can see several examples here that people have used. And if someone has a question that they'd like to ask, we're happy to let them enter it into the chat space. And we can either address it right now, or we can jump into question and answer toward the end here. But I would encourage Jo Kister, if she's got a question, to drop it into the chat space so we can take a look at it. Entry events need to be varied. You can't always rely on the field trip or the guest speaker. You need to mix things up a little bit. And some of the AC projects do this very nicely, sort of reimagining different encounters that will get students started on their project. I'm curious if people have examples that they would want to share of things that they may have done in launching a project. And if not, I'll share one or two examples that I've seen from best practice going around from this list. But I see someone is having trouble seeing the webinar. That's the question. So perhaps Zach or Brooke can work on that challenge while I'm talking about entry events, since that seems to be a GoToMeeting issue more than a content question. So in thinking about these entry events, we need to remember that they're not going to drive inquiry or need to know all the way through a project for most students. Startling statistics are very popular, and given that some of the AC courses deal with sustainability and environmental issues, resource use and those kinds of things, there's a website that a teacher introduced me to years ago, and I'll type it in here in the message bar so it can be shared out. It's www.breathingearth.net. And what's neat about that website is it's a set of streaming data from both two very different sources of information. One is from the CIA World Factbook, and the other is from the United Nations Development Program. So two different very perspectives on what's going on in the world. And it's a streaming real-time tracker of births, deaths, and energy use and CO2 emissions around the world, country by country. And anybody who opens this website up and looks at it for a few minutes is going to be sort of astounded when they realize how many people are born every minute, how many people are dying every minute, and the amount of energy that is used to keep our human population going and what the carbon impact is on that. And again, this is coming from two competing sets of data, so it's a somewhat objective site that was developed by some engineers, if I remember correctly, at MIT to pull those two streams together. So you could have students watch that and see those startling statistics for a while and then get them thinking about how that relates to their project. That's one example. It's not taken from the AC curriculum, but the AC curricula all launch with different kinds of events like this to try to generate student inquiry. Many teachers use simulations or activities, and as I mentioned, many of the AC courses rely on field trips and guest speakers. But you need to really think about knowing your students and doing an entry event that works for them. If you want the excitement that you see in the young boy next to you in the image, you're never really going to get it by saying, yep, we're going to start a unit on whatever, or we're going to start a project on wave generators. Very few students are going to get this excited about it. So you need to think about an event that will really launch that inquiry and get them excited. Glad the problem has been resolved so that Joe can see the webinar. Let's advance on and think about checkpoints, or another way to create short-term need to know. And many of the AC projects have these checkpoints. We use the metaphor of the password or the passport in the BIE workshop because people think it's fun when they travel and they go through a pass control and they get a certain stamp from a country that proves that they were there. Once upon a time, those passport control places were actually kind of scary places. There were gates and guards with guns, and there still are that somewhat in some countries. But in many cases, people have started to think about these checkpoints as a fun and positive experience. And we want to encourage you to help students see checkpoints not as like I'm checking up on you to see what your grade should be, but I'm checking up on you so I can mark your progress in the journey of working on this project. And so these three things, good driving questions, good entry events, and good checkpoints, are one way that helps create need-to-knows for you as a professional educator. You want to see where those things are happening in your AC projects and get familiar with them so you can make sure that you're using them to keep students moving forward. But short-term need-to-knows also have a lot to do with your students. And again, this is where knowing your curriculum is really only half the battle. You've got, as Zach mentioned, the giant West Virginia project curriculum, and SREB has put a ton of time into developing professional resources for you to teach this and others of their AC courses. And the summer training institutes that they do will be a great opportunity to sink your teeth into that. But once you walk away from those institutes and you've got a good sense of what the curriculum is, you need to be thinking about the different types of students that you have in your program and using the parts of that curriculum that are going to work effectively to help your students succeed in the projects, rather than just sort of teaching it page by page and turning the page. So if you take some time to know your students, you'll see that your students, when they come to class, actually operate with 3 or 4 different short-term need-to-knows. And one of them is this simple one. Kids get excited and they take stuff out into the hallway and talk about it when they immediately see how they can use information in the projects with their friends. And we'll look at an example later where that might be possible even though the question is a larger professional training question, but there's a side application that they might get into that would allow them to use it with friends. So as you look at those AC projects and you look at different parts of the project's design, you can think about, well, is this one of these places where I want to help them see the connection of how they could use this practice with their friends and get them excited to want to learn this again, to need to know this, rather than just telling them, here's another thing for you to do, you need to know this in that sense, like because I told you you need to know it. Another thing kids can get excited about, and it certainly helps with our parent relationships as teachers, is when kids see how they can use this at home. And a typical example of this from a lot of projects that we work with at BIE is when kids are doing projects that relate to gardens. And when kids are doing a garden at school, they may be able to go home and help their parents think about a garden. Or if kids learn how to fix something at home that's wrong with their house as part of a project, it's exciting that they can come home and help their parents figure out how to fix an appliance or fix a leak in the roof or something like that. So when you see an opportunity for students to say, you know, not only will you be able to use this if you got a career in this field, but you can actually go home and help your folks out around the house if you know how to do this. That's part of why kids want to come to schools. They want to feel like adults and contributing members to their family, and not just always the kids who have to rely on their parents. And especially when you're working with high school age kids, that's part of how they establish their independence, is being able to do some of those things on their own. So a short-term need to know for your students may come from, can they use it at home? It may also come from, with some students, especially when you're dealing with technical work, the question of, is it technically interesting to me right now? And this is where thinking about the role that PBL has in a general constructivist education philosophy is important. What we're talking about is sort of thinking about what's technically challenging for a student who's a 10th grader versus a 12th grader and the exposure they have to different forms of technology, different coursework. And is the project hitting that so-called zone of proximal development, that place that students can do a lot of this work on their own and they just need you sort of like the spotter on a weight bench. It sort of helps make sure that you don't drop the heavy weight on yourself. You know you can do it, you know you can lift it, but you feel a lot better having that teacher who's there to guide you or mentor you right at the right moment when you need it. And if you see something that you know, many of your students are talking about technical applications of computers or video games that they're playing, and they're sort of curious, how do they make those noises and sounds line up in a game, and your project is suddenly dealing with something like that, then helping them see that there's a technical connection that's interesting to them to right now is going to create a short-term need to know, to dive in and actually learn the math and some of the programming skills that would be necessary to understand that. And the application may not be to video gaming, but if they see the connection, they'll be, aha, I want to learn how to do this, because if I know how to do this for this work, I also understand the games that I like to play in my own spare time. The last short-term need to know is we need to acknowledge that many of our students, they're working toward a career goal by taking your AC courses, but they also have jobs that they work in right now. Some of them may really want to be certified auto mechanics, and they may be working in a gas station right now to get close to that. Some of them may want to be doing sophisticated environmental engineering work of some sort, and they may be working in a summer job or a fall, spring job in a landscape or at a nursery where they're thinking about the kind of plants that are sustainable. And so if you see an opportunity for a student to be able to go to work at night after school or on weekends and say, wow, the stuff that we're doing in our AC course right now, it allows me to really think about the work that I do here differently and contribute, that's going to create a short-term need to know for students also. They're going to be very excited about being able to make that contribution. So if you think about those long-term need to knows that we talked about at the beginning, getting ready for a career, thinking about whether these skills help them be employable, those help, but reaching these short-term need to knows are really important, and they go back to some of your voice and choice as an educator. If you can see these things in the AC courses, then you can make a choice to give voice to that and say, you know, the curriculum doesn't talk about this, but I see a connection to what some of you do for your day jobs or your after-school jobs. Or the curriculum doesn't talk about this, but I bet you could use this with your friends, right? Using that professional voice and choice as an educator will help keep students interested and motivated in the project work. And that may not necessarily happen with every single work or activity that you do as part of the AC courses, but whenever you can see it, if you make those connections, it's going to be a very successful experience for you and your students because it'll re-engage them and get them excited about the work if they're maybe reaching a slow point. So I want to look at a case study that sort of looks at these short-term needs to knows generally, and then we'll move forward and sort of think about them in more detail. And moving forward is the theme here, so let's just keep doing that. In looking at creating short-term need-to-knows, I want to take a look at a case study, and you have this example in the email that was sent to you of a course from Innovations in Science and Technology. And the driving question or essential question for that course is how can we best use existing power sources found in the wilderness to create electrical power for modern communications devices. As you look at that example, you get a sense of what students are asked to do. They're in a wilderness setting, imagining a situation where traditional power supplies aren't available. They're doing research and experiments using natural resources to figure out how they could recharge a dead cell phone. And through the process of working on this project, they're going to choose a design for an alternative energy system that will allow them to create a prototype that they could talk about. I think this is really an excellent example of how students can think about how they might use this themselves before getting really deep into the project and thinking about the final part of it, which is choosing a design for a potential alternative energy power system that they could create and prototype and market. Many students enjoy spending time in the outdoors. They might be bicyclists, they might be hunters, fishers, etc. They can start thinking of the places where this would be really useful, and this problem that they're trying to solve as a professional part of their career education starts to become an application that they can see as an opportunity to think about how they could use this if their cell phone died while they were out in the wilderness or out riding their bike on a backcountry trail somewhere. And that's going to be kind of an exciting thing for them to think about. You know, we're working on this in our class, and it's something that I could use to share. You know, if this ever happens to you, I can share it with my friends. I can use it myself in this outside situation. Maybe one of their parents works in those kinds of environments, and they'd be excited to go home and say, Dad, so in class, what's going on right now? We're thinking about this cell phone, and you know, I'm starting to come up with a design of something that you can keep in your truck. So when you're out working, you know, if you're working in the Forest Service or whether you're far away and you have these materials, you could recharge your cell phone. Another thing that we need to acknowledge is that kids are often just forgetful, right? They sometimes forget to charge their cell phone. I know my teenage kids do all the time, and I call them and I get the voicemail that says, you know, the person is not available, and it's because they didn't charge their cell phone. And if they had an idea of a way that they could generate some kind of alternative energy, that might help them get out of that jam on occasion too. So this project is a really sophisticated and technically challenging project, but it also has a real short-term need to know for a lot of kids. Because there's one thing that we know about our teenage students is that they hate being separated from their digital devices. And if we've got a project that helps them think about a way that they can have an alternative energy backup for that, that's going to get them excited. Regardless of whether they ever get to the point of prototyping, which they will eventually, at least at first, they're going to really want to get into this project and think about it. So that's the general kind of idea we're talking about, and I want to thank Zach and Brooke from the SREB for taking some time to look through the SREB courses and find the perfect example for that. I'm certain that there are other examples like this, but I think this really hits the point home that you know, you can see in this project description immediate application, not just a long-term need to know so that the student might think, well, I'd like to go to work for an alternative energy company, and someday I might use this prototype. They can think about doing it right now, and enterprising students might actually try to market one of those prototypes in their local community and talk to local business owners and get it launched because they may see that there is a need for that. You may laugh about that, but there are a couple of interesting videos that we use at BIE. One that I really like is called From Worms to Wall Street. It started out as a garden project, and that the third grade students were doing, and the fifth grade students were so interested in all the money that the kids in third grade were making that the fifth grade students engineered a leveraged buyout. They ended up cornering the market and bought the third grade kids out because there was money to be made. And in some cases, a school that I work with runs a garden project that actually the students help the school generate $25,000 to $30,000 a year by creating compost that they sell on the local market. And people like to buy it because they know that they're supporting education. So there's some real interesting short-term need to knows, and this cell phone example is a really good one. So this question of creating a short-term needs to knows ends up connecting a lot to assessment. And we talked last week a little bit about assessment, but I want to talk about your role as a teacher before we look at more detailed examples. During a project, in terms of balancing the tension between coaching students and helping them think about how to get better and the grades that you will need to assign them as they move forward toward the end of the project. It really is a balancing act. And it will vary from district to district. We are not going to encourage you to change the district or community grading policies that we work in, but you do need to be thinking about when you've got a student who's excited to learn about how they could make this cell phone device, and they start doing stuff that you can coach them and say, this is great, but it's not an assignment I can give you a grade from in the SREB project that's designed. You need to think about how you're going to balance that. How long do you let the kid run down that path of working on something that isn't quite exactly what the course designed? It makes it hard for you to assign grades for it. Because if the student is learning, you want to support that, but if they're going too far afield and they're starting to do stuff that moves past the standards and objectives that the course laid out, you're going to become nervous as an instructor about whether the student is still on task, right? And so while we want to use that enthusiasm for a short-term need to know, we don't want to let the students turn the project into something completely different because it makes it very difficult to assess it and then give grades based on those assessments. So sometimes what can happen is students will lean just heavily to the grade, right? They'll say, I just want to do well on this project. I don't, you know, and they avoid innovation and creativity and the critical thinking that we'll talk about later. And as a mentor, you might want to shift things and do that balancing act so that you get them back to a point where you can coach them and think about doing really interesting and critical stuff. And other times, it's balanced in the wrong direction. Students are going down that path and they're doing stuff that isn't directly relevant to testable or gradable outcomes, and then you're going to want to sort of go backwards here, right, and shift your emphasis back to, we need to get back to some of the work that needs to happen so that we can really assign grades for this work in the project. That is part of that mentor in the center that I talked about last week, which is why we're using these balance slides again. It's not just knowing how to balance voice and choice, but it's knowing how to balance it in a way that ultimately leads students to being successful on the graded outcomes for the project. So it's a tricky balancing act, and you may find, oh, going the wrong direction, you may find yourself seesawing back and forth, but you do need to think about that, and different teams will go in different directions. Most of the AC projects are designed to have students working in teams, and one team may go off in a very creative and interesting direction, and another team may go off very much on the, well, what do I need to do, what are the specs of the project, I want to get a good grade direction. It can be helpful sometimes as a mentor to get those two teams talking to each other and learning from each other. While we're talking about grading, we kind of have to talk about the question of cheating, so to speak. And on assignments that are clearly meant to be individual work, you don't want to have students cheating, obviously. But if there are opportunities where student teams can learn from one another, I think it's an important thing to have some crossover between those teams so that the team that's being very creative but is hard to grade can learn from the team that is more grade-focused and vice versa. So it's a tricky balancing act, but it's one that I encourage you to look for opportunities to practice that balancing act in the SREB curriculum. Where do you think students are going to tend to veer off course and do more creative things that will be helpful for coaching, but maybe not so helpful for grading? And where do you think that students who are just used to getting the grade may need some support from you to drift out and do more innovative and creative work? Subject matter experts can also be a tremendous help in this regard also. As a professional educator, it is ultimately your job to grade the student work. So if you're going to lean on one side, you're going to lean toward the grading side of this equation. Subject matter experts, on the other hand, really don't understand much about how to calculate grades unless they happen to be subject matter experts in a course that deals with training people to be teachers. In that case, they're going to be other teachers and they get it. But most outside subject matter experts get really uncomfortable when they're asked to grade student work. So really, part of that balancing act can be using the people who come from outside the community, outside the school, from the community, to support student learning. And these are specified in the SREB project, and ideas are given to how to find those people and work with them. They can be really good at doing some of the assessment and coaching to help students reach peak performance when you grade them. So sometimes it can be kind of a good cop, bad cop routine. You know, I'm the grader as the instructor, as the teacher, and the subject matter expert will do a lot of the coaching and the support and helping you think about getting better and coaching the assessment. So that's another piece of advice about how to work with that, which means it's really important that you think about, as you look at your SREB course program, you know, who are the right subject matter experts? As you're going through that curriculum, pay close attention to the recommendations that SREB makes about who you should be reaching out into in your community, And remember that if you can't find someone in your community, it is very likely that you can probably find someone in a nearby community that you can work with through distance mediums like a webinar, Google Hangouts, Skype, and things like that. Many teachers think that adults who work in other fields may not want to be involved in this, but my own experience has been that if you ask for mentors, they will come. And the problem is that we rarely ask for mentors to help kids learn about what they're experts in. We tend to ask them to come and volunteer to support literacy or math competency, and that's not as interesting for adults who are working in the professional world. But if someone has a chance, as one program that I work with did, I have a CEO of a major company that designs parts for truck engines, who is so excited to have a chance to work with a young person in our community who just wants to be an inventor. And this CEO started his company by doing invention, and he wants to go back to that point of discovering something new. He now runs a multi-million-dollar company based on his invention. He misses the fun of tinkering that this young child wants to work with him, and so he gives up part of his week every week, a couple hours every week, to work with this young person because he loves that feeling of invention that is no longer part of his day-to-day operations. So those people are out there. You just need to ask for it. Ultimately, if you think about this balancing of assessment that I'm talking about, and this actually comes from a career technical training program in the tourism industry that came from the Academy Foundation. If you are balancing assessment in this way and doing a balance of grading and assessment, by the time the final grade report is due, it's a lot easier to calculate it because you'll have a pretty strong sense of what students have been doing throughout the project. And SRAB projects give you lots of opportunities for formative assessment to do that and to give coaching to kids to make sure they do better. And a big part of the shift to project-based learning, and I wanted to mention this before going on to the two final case studies, is accepting that it's a lot more thinking up front. Looking at these AC courses and learning them is going to be a lot more upfront learning. But done right, it often means a lot less work toward the end as you are grading student work, because so many good formative assessment opportunities are provided in this curriculum that you have a good sense of what students are doing by the time they get to that final presentation or that final product that they showcase or exhibit. And really that final presentation is a confirmation of a long pattern of results, or maybe one last chance for a student to prove that they can do it. But rarely is it the whole ball of wax, the whole bag of marbles, to use whatever metaphor you want. So your final project grade sheet is going to be a lot easier to complete if you're using all the resources that are available to you in the AC curriculum through a balanced plan. All right, so I want to take a moment and dig deeper into two different case studies where we think about how 21st century competencies, in this case critical thinking and creativity, can actually, where you see opportunities to use them, can actually help to create student need-to-knows, get them excited about their learning. So let's talk about critical thinking first. At Buck Institute for Education, we spend a lot of time thinking critically about critical thinking. And we took 4 years, I think, actually, to develop our critical thinking rubric, which is a tool that's available to you if you want to use that. And I know that SRAB has some good advice about these competencies as well in their materials. But by the time we were sort of toward the end of this, we ended up stumbling upon this fellow named Roland Case, who lives in Western Canada and has got an institute devoted to critical thinking. And we like his notion that critical thinking is not a skill that's separate from content, and it's not content that's separate from skill. The two things really need to work together in tandem. And people tend to think of critical thinking as a hierarchy of deeper levels or Bloom's taxonomy or that kind of stuff. And Case's focus on it is really that it's about the way students approach content. Right? It's not a separate thing that they do. You don't teach critical thinking. You teach them to teach or to think critically about the content that they're working with. So when BIE worked on critical thinking, we came up with a few different bullet points about what good critical thinking looks like in a project. We think it looks like comparing information from different sources, and there are a wealth of opportunities to do that in your SRAB materials. We think it is an opportunity for students to draw their own conclusions, and then for you or subject matter experts to offer feedback on that, because it's a bit of a risk to draw your own conclusions. It may not be only drawing conclusions, it may also be summarizing or creating their own presentations that explain material in a summary fashion. It may be analyzing competing arguments, looking at what some people say about what are valid alternative energy sources versus what other people say. There are a lot of different debates about what counts as alternative energy right now, and there are great opportunities for students to think critically about that. And that's going to engage some of their passions because, as we know, we have different students with different opinions and different viewpoints in the classroom. So that's going to create that short-term need to know. Developing a convincing argument out of that is also important because if a student's passion is engaged, they're going to be able to convince other people that they're right, and that will keep them working hard. And ultimately, trying to solve really complex problems that are real for them is an important part of critical thinking as well. So you want to make sure that the problems that students are wrestling with in those projects are appropriate or, as I said earlier, technically interesting to them right now. So how do these things create need to knows? I talked about it a little bit, but wherever a student has a chance to draw their own conclusions, they're on the spot, and it creates a short-term need to know for them. It's not about just evaluating which conclusion is better, but it's saying, I want you to tell me what you think. And my wife, who is a college professor, always tells me this is one thing that students never get to really do in high school. They're never asked to draw their own conclusions. They're just asked to repeat the teacher's conclusions. And I think even in a career technical setting, if your students are not necessarily college-bound but are thinking about going straight into a work environment, we know that many employers are very much looking for students who can draw their own conclusions. And in fact, Thomas Friedman at the New York Times wrote this very controversial and interesting piece a couple of months ago about why Google is no longer hiring A students, because those kids don't tend to draw their own conclusions. They just repeat what the teacher said. So drawing their own conclusions is important. Summarizing, paraphrasing, coming up with things that are in their own words, again, puts them on the spot. Developing convincing arguments is something that they want to prove that they're right, and one of the things we know that teenagers like to do is prove that they're right, so that will create a short-term need to know. And again, a complex problem that's appropriate for them at their age level, like the cell phone challenge, will create short-term need to knows. So if we look at another project example, and in your notes that were sent out by email, this is case study number 2 from the New Jersey Global Logistics and Supply Chain Management course, course number 1, project number 1. It's a great example to pour over to see how critical thinking can be used to create these short-term need to knows for students that get them to continue to work on the big challenge that they're asked to do in this project. How might delays in supply chain be mitigated is the driving or essential question, right? And just a reminder that I work at BIE and we say driving questions. We're partnering with SREB and they use the language of essential questions, and they're essentially the same question so long as the question is driving kids to do the inquiry. So how might delays in the supply chain be mitigated? This question is made real and driving for students by the entry event activity, where they're asked to think about some time or something in a store where there was something that they really, really wanted and they were out of it, right? And getting students to think about a real-world situation that they've encountered and then wondering about how they would deal with it. This is making this authentic and real to them rather than giving them an artificial scenario from, fake company Y has this problem, how would you solve that? Kids need to connect to something that they remember feeling like, boy, I really wanted to get those tickets to that concert and they sold out really fast, right? How could I have changed that supply and made sure that the performers or the concert managers knew that they needed more? Or maybe kids forgot to buy gas on Saturday night, and then Sunday they had to get to work, and they realized that all the gas stations were closed on Sunday morning, which happens less and less now, but I'm in Wyoming right now, and I think it happens because I ran into that on the way up here. And they realized, boy, I needed to think about supply of gasoline and how that works as a real-world issue. So they're asked to think about how it connects to their life first, and then brainstorming different ideas about how that might lead to delays in supply and how they could fix that. And then the immediate application they're asked to think about in this project is, again, not to some artificial company, but to perhaps their school environment or maybe their local work environment, so that after their initial brainstorming, their application is directly relevant to them. And it creates a short-term need to know. This obviously happens in an introductory level project. It's the first project in the first course of this Global Logistics and Supply Management program. And it's really right for students to be thinking about it in those terms right there. Eventually, they'll have a chance to interact with professionals later in the course who help them think about what this looks like in a real company or in specific companies. But it gives students a chance to think critically about a problem that's relevant for them and understand that this challenge is a very real challenge that people in this career field face. But they start by wearing it on their own shoes rather than imagining that there's somebody else. So I think this is a good example of how critical thinking can be used to create a short-term need to know that will get students excited about doing the work that they've chosen to do in the long term. And it could be applied later as they're doing some of the more advanced coursework, asking them to go back and remember that project we did right at the beginning where you remember that you were short on something. So now we're looking at something else that you may have experienced a shortage of, and what did it feel like to be short on that? And how would you figure out how to supply and solve that problem to make sure that stock was there for just-in-time delivery, as it were. So I think that's a really nice example of that one. Midway through the project, students can see some applications of their work. They start, the middle point of the project is starting to think about how could we solve a supply chain problem in our cafeteria or our bookstore or that kind of situation. And it helps them make their school community better and makes them feel like contributing citizens to that school community. And I think I've said it in previous workshops, but I'll say it again, or in previous parts of the webinar, but project-based learning is about helping students become participatory learners rather than just preparing them for work later. And kids get engaged and feel like they need to know when they can see how what they're doing allows them to participate now. They're tired of hearing you'll use this someday, even when it's related to a career field they've decided to do. So when they can start using this, as this project is an example, or a project I just did with some teachers at the Ohio Career Program who had students design a new and more effective fire exit plan for their building when an addition was added to the building. Kids felt really empowered by making this difference, and what was really fun for them is that they understood the fire evacuation plan better than most of the teachers in the building by the time it was over, and they got to teach the teachers how to get out of the building in a safe way and know where to meet their students and encounter them. So being able to use that knowledge midway through the project keeps the need to know going, and it involves a lot of critical thinking. We're going to wrap up in case studies with thinking at this question of creativity. And you're increasingly hearing about the need for students to tinker, to play, to experiment in class before we teach them things, because that's what gets them creating short-term need-to-knows. People are doing a lot of work with 3D printers or coding systems or Arduino, and you've got a lot of opportunities like this in the AC projects that are spelled out where kids tinker first to see what their creativity will do, and maybe even give an opportunity to demonstrate some of that creativity at a local maker fair or creator space. I know a lot of those are popping up around where I live in Colorado now, where other like-minded professional tinkerers are just coming together and sharing, I'm tinkering with this, I'm tinkering with that, etc. And some of them are ending up coming up with patentable ideas. So creativity involves that kind of play, prototyping, tinkering, and in the BIE thinking about creativity as a 21st century competency. Brainstorming and concept mapping is one way to do that. Generating lists of your own ideas, testing out those ideas, as I said earlier, prototyping and seeing how they work are important. Inventing a solution and trying it out to a very complex open-ended question offers space for creativity, as does creating an original product or performance. So whenever students have an opportunity to make something and show it off as part of an AC project, that can be really exciting for them. And we're going to look at one of those things in a moment when we look at the example. How does creativity generate need to know? When students start generating their own ideas and talking about them with each other, they lead to new questions that they need to ask. Somebody comes up and says, well, what if we did this? And somebody else on the team says, well, I don't know, what would happen? Let's think about that. So when students have opportunities to generate their own ideas, they force themselves to deepen their inquiry and think more critically about stuff. When students invent a solution, they also have to come up with a way to test that solution and see whether that works. So they've created a short-term need to know that may lead them to things that you as a teacher think they need to know to succeed in the project, like test design or engineering principles of test design. And then finally, when they create an original project and they wonder, they wonder if it expresses their ideas and if it works well, they may realize that they need to learn something about focus grouping or surveying or letting certain select groups test market or test out a product and see if it works for them. So all of these things end up creating new questions that you don't have to get them to think about. They should come to them on their own. When we look at our example from the Arkansas Innovations in Science and Technology course that you have, it's your third example here. The essential question again is, what is the best way to design a bicycle anti-theft device for security situations affecting a university student? And I like this as an example of how creativity can create short-term and sustained need-to-knows for students because it works on a couple of different levels. First off, most students have had a bicycle at some point and know the pain that many typical bicycle locks are. So it connects to their own experience. Many students are also curious about what life is like after high school. As they move out of this career, some are thinking about going to college for further study, and so they're curious, what is university life like? And if I'm going to be talking to university students to do this project, I'm going to have a chance to meet some university students and maybe learn a little bit more about what that world is like. But they're also asked here to be creative and to say, find out from university students, what's wrong with traditional bike locks? Why would I need something different? How could I create something different? And then they're going to create those devices and test them. They'll engineer them, share their solutions, get feedback from the university students in the local community. Note these university students could also be community college students. They could be night students who maybe are coming back to career technical programs to re-engage and get degrees that they weren't able to finish. It could be a lot of different people here, but the essential issue is it's somebody who uses a bicycle to get to where they're going, and they're tired of having it get stolen. But they're also tired of the risk of it getting stolen, and they're also tired of some of the things that are wrong with bike locks. They're tangly, complicated combinations, etc. So it's a chance for students to be creative, and in the process of doing that, that creativity will open up need-to-knows that will keep them working on the project throughout. So the driving question or essential questions of that project, what is the best way to design a bicycle anti-theft device for security, will keep students going for a while, but there are lots of other great things designed in the SREB AC course that will create short-term need-to-knows because the students are asked to create some of the solutions and to create the ways that they'll interview and sample and get focus group information to support their product ideas. So in this case, the material is going to be presented in a way that's technically interesting to students right now. It's a real-world question that has an authentic application that they're going to be curious about, rather than something like designing a product that they have no contact or relationship to. Maybe that's going to be technically interesting to someone because of the computer coding that goes on and the student is interested in that language or that technique of coding. But for creating short-term need-to-knows, as often as you can get it connected to something that's technically interesting to them right now, the more likely it is to be successful. So as you think about looking at your AC course that Zach sent out to all of you, or the other course that you may be teaching if that one doesn't directly apply to you, when we wrap up this webinar, I want you to be thinking about where can you emphasize these relevant 21st century competencies like critical thinking and creativity to increase short-term need-to-knows for your students. And I would just encourage you to sort of skim through and get a sense of what each part of the curriculum is about and say, is this a place like that? Is this a place where we could use creativity and critical thinking to get them excited about the project again? There are going to be times when you do have to just teach them information. You want to balance that with times that we've been talking about where they can get excited again and be creative or think critically about what you taught them. So I want you to really focus on trying to identify that. And remember our driving question or essential question here. So what are my need-to-knows? What do I need to know about my AC project in order that I can identify those checkpoints that will keep my students in the need-to-know? And I hope when you come back for the last webinar next Wednesday night at 6 o'clock Eastern, that you'll have an opportunity to have thought about that so that we can see how voice and choice and using need-to-knows can help you get students down to a deeper level of inquiry that allows us to go way back to the beginning of this presentation where we had that image that says that BIE and SREB working together should be helping you raise the standards in career technical education. Because what we want is not just students meeting the standards because they're curious or because they have a voice and a choice about how to do so. We want them really exceeding the standards and being the kind of graduate that employers are looking for or that higher education is looking for to train people in these technical fields. And in-depth inquiry is what's going to raise those standards. Getting kids who are asking not just the questions that you start with, not just answering the essential question, not just answering one of those questions in the curriculum, but really asking questions of their own and taking this course to a place that you as a teacher and perhaps even SREB had not imagined it could go. And when students are doing that kind of work, they're going to be nailing the AC course projects and they're going to be doing work that you'll be proud to celebrate throughout the community. So I'm mindful that our time is about up. We've got about 5 minutes left. I want to say that I did share my email there on the initial slide. It's tim@bie.org. And I'll type it in here again. But if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you're welcome to ask that question right now, and we'll think about it briefly. But if there's a question that you'd like to ask and dig in more deeply, I would encourage you to send me that question, tim@bie.org. I want to be transparent about something right now, and that is that the third webinar is not done yet, because we were hoping that we'd have some input from you in terms of your questions about voice and choice and in-depth inquiry. So I would love to hear from a couple of you if you have a question that you'd like to ask that I could make sure gets answered in the final webinar, so that you can go into your summer institutes really feeling like you understand how to use voice and choice, need to knows, and in-depth inquiry to really make your AC projects a success for your students. So if you don't have a question to share right at this moment, I do really want to encourage you to send me an email if there's a question you'd like to ask, and I'll make sure that it gets addressed next week as part of the final version of the webinar, which, don't panic, Zach, it's 90% done. It's not quite done. So.
Okay, I'm trying to think how people can say they have a question. I guess they can click on that question box.
Yeah, they can click on the question box and write it in the chat space, right? Or they can just email me directly, tim@bie.org, if they want to send a question to me directly, and I'll try to make sure it gets addressed next week, because we are rather short on time here.
Okay. Well, looks like nobody has a question. Apparently you did too good a job again. And so we're going to wait, but I'm sure we will take advantage of your email address, and any questions we have over the next couple of days about this will come to you, and then we look forward to next Wednesday where we can see the answers to any of those questions.
Right. We did get one question.
We do, sure.
Okay,
let's
great.
take it.
What is the assessment map?
Oh, that's from last week, the assessment map that we talked about. I can get a copy of that to Zach that he can pass out. And the assessment map is a tool that we use at BIE both to plan effective projects and also to help teachers look at complex curriculum like the AC projects and understand what the real essential parts of the project are that every student needs to know and be able to do in a way that gives students voice and choice about how they tackle the project, right? So that you don't need to necessarily teach it in a linear, like this page to that page to that page. So once you start thinking about what the final product is the product is asking for, and what skills and standards are necessary to make that product, and where in the curriculum that's being assessed, then you have a map that allows you to know that even if students are not necessarily on schedule, if they're doing work that shows up on that map, it's okay. And you can let them have some voice and choice about what they work on. So I will try to send that map to Zach and make sure that we talk about how to use the assessment map next week to drive in-depth inquiry so that you have that map to look at again, and so that I can talk about how we use it to diagnose a project. And it's a really good tool for you to be looking at your AC curriculum and the projects in that curriculum to try to understand really what the essence of those projects is, to make sure that you're knowing what every student needs to be able to master. So thanks, it's a great question, whoever asked it. It's one of the things I hate about webinars is I never get to meet anybody or know their names, but I'm glad that somebody had the desire to ask that question, had the need to know that they needed to get an answer to it, and I'll make sure that's included in next week's webinar. Thank you.
Okay, before I sign off, Brooke, do you have any others?
No, I think y'all are good.
No?
All right,
Okay.
well, thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
Thank you.